With my Federal Reserve players, we are going to talk about the 4 tools of the Federal Reserve. Here they are, and we're going to break each one down. The Federal Reserve can buy and sell securities or bonds on the open market. They can set the discount rate, set the reserve ratio, and they can pay interest on reserves and excess reserves. All of the Federal Reserve's tools influence the market for money. So when the Federal Reserve enacts expansionary policy, they increase the money supply, meaning that interest rates go down and more money is available for lending. When they enact contractionary monetary policy, they decrease the amount of money available, which means that less money is available and nominal interest rates go up. If you'll remember from our quantity theory of money, the more money that's available, that changes nominal interest rates, but we're not sure where inflation is. So if real interest rates change, we can't be certain unless we know what's happening with real GDP as well. Let's start with the reserve ratio. This is the percentage of demand deposits banks must keep in their account and not lend out. When the reserve ratio is high, banks are not willing to lend money out because it costs them money to borrow to make sure that they're reaching that reserve ratio if they go over. When the reserve ratio is low, banks are more willing to lend out money. Now, this is a policy, the changing of the reserve ratio, that is very rarely used and hasn't been used in my lifetime. It would be so disruptive to bank practice to change the reserve ratio because it would open so much money. If you think about it as sort of like a dam breaking, even lowering the reserve ratio from 10%, which it currently is, to 9% would be hundreds of millions, if not more, dollars that would go out into the economy pretty much immediately. So this tool is very rarely used.
Hey, Curious George. Welcome to the Bank of Reagan. You say you want to borrow money to open a banana stand? I don't have any money. All my money is sitting in the Federal Reserve to meet the Federal Reserve ratio. I'm here to verify this word, the reserve ratio. It looks like it's locked, but it's not really. Thanks. Cheers, George. Now I have lots of money. I can make you a loan.
Now think about for a second your opportunity cost of holding cash. If you've got cash in your pocket, you could have it in a savings account and be earning money off of it. That'd be a great place to put money that you need quickly, but you want to make a little money off of it. So the Federal Reserve has the same issue. When they require banks to put money in their reserve ratio, it has an opportunity cost. Banks could be lending that out for money. Now, one thing banks do know is that that money is extremely safe with the Federal Reserve. Money's not going to be any good if the Federal Reserve goes under. The Federal Reserve decided and asked for and was given permission to pay interest on required and excess reserves as of 2008. So when the bank has extra money, they can put their required reserve in, and then they can put, and often did put, additional monies in there. The Federal Reserve will pay interest rates on that money. As of 2008, they've been paying, and this time last year, the required reserve rate was 2.35%. That means that banks could make money by having money in their account at the Federal Reserve, and they do pretty well. 2.35% is pretty good. If this rate is lowered, as it has been recently with the coronavirus crisis, then banks are more likely to lend money out because they can make more money through loans rather than lending with the Fed. Another important thing to note is that while making loans is risky, putting money in your account at the Fed is considered extremely safe. So that 2.35% is guaranteed. However, if they made me a loan for the car, I may or may not pay it back. So you can see while the interest rate was up at 2.35 and even 2.4% at the end of 2019 and at the beginning of 2020, it dropped a bit. The Fed saw a recession coming on. And then with the coronavirus crisis, it has dropped to 0.10. So the banks are now being encouraged to lend that money out rather than leave it with the Federal Reserve.
We think there should be less money. We're going to raise the interest rate, reserves, and exit reserves. Sorry, George. You're too risky. I put my money with the Fed. Man, the Fed's paying a lot of money. I'm going to give my money to them.
As you can see, the Federal Reserve lowers the reserve ratio and they take money out of their vault and allow those banks to take that money out of their required reserve, which they keep with an account at the Fed. So the Fed takes it out of their vault and gives it to the banks to do with as they wish. And of course, banks are in the business of loaning money. So the goal is that the bank will lend that money out. That's why our money multiplier is 1 over the required reserve ratio. So you take the money out of the bank, and as banks lend it out, it multiplies throughout the economy because those loans are deposited in other banks that can then be lent out based on what has to be kept in reserve and what can be lent out. So changing the reserve ratio can have a huge impact on the economy. The next tool that the Federal Reserve uses, which is pretty common during a crisis, is the discount rate. This is the rate at which banks can borrow from the Fed. So we've talked about earlier that if the Federal Reserve doesn't reach their required reserve ratio at the end of the day, and they never know who's going to borrow money from them, they can borrow from another bank or from the Federal Reserve to meet that required reserve ratio. Borrowing from other banks is seen as preferential. They're people who are in the business of making loans. You borrow from other banks and you borrow at the Fed funds rate, which we'll discuss in more depth here in a minute. The discount rate is usually higher than the Fed funds rate, and borrowing from the Fed is seen as a bad thing. If other banks, folks who are in the same business you are, won't lend you money, you're not seen as very trustworthy, and that can be very problematic. So going to borrow from the Fed is often seen as kind of like going to mom and asking for money. You know, you're not supposed to need to do that.
Times are really hard. I can't loan you any money.
It's called sometimes the discount window. Banks would literally walk up to the window just like you would walk up to a window and make a transaction at a bank. However, now most of that's done electronically, so the phrasing still exists, but it's really the discount rate and it's borrowing at the discount rate. But if you hear discount window, it's the same thing. During the coronavirus crisis, the Fed has lowered the discount rate and they are encouraging banks to borrow from them. So while these borrowings are reported, and they're reported on about an 18-month delay, the Fed is now saying, hey, we want everybody to borrow from us. So it's set at a discount, hence the name, to other bank lending processes. And typically this rate is still very low. But not only did they lower it, but they were pleased to see or encourage JP Morgan Chase, the huge bank in the United States, to publicly say that they would be borrowing from the Federal Reserve. So they're trying to make it not embarrassing to have to go borrow from the Fed during this crisis.
Hey George, you need to withdraw all your money? That's a lot. $10,000. This. Here you go. 5. Oh no, I can't make my reserve ratio. You can borrow money from me. All my money? What do I have to pay on that money? Discount rates, of course.
The final tool of monetary policy used by the Federal Reserve is that of buying and selling government securities. Often we say government bonds, and that's interchangeable. And those are treasury notes. Treasury notes are held by consumers, they're held by businesses, and they're held by banks. The treasury notes that the Federal Reserve buys and sells, if any of you have been to a lake and the water supply is low, they've let a lot of water go through the dam, sort of out into the world, and the lake is very low. When they close the dam, that water doesn't go out, it stays in the lake. Well, our money supply is similar. The Federal Reserve holds their money in their lockbox, and if they buy bonds, then they're pushing money out into the economy. If they sell bonds, then they're pulling money back, and they use that to affect nominal interest rates and nominal GDP monetary policy. That's a part of our quantity theory of money as well. So when the Fed buys and sells bonds, they shift the money supply. Again, buying bonds, you want to think of the Fed, and I always do my hands with this. When the Fed buys bonds, they're putting money out. What do you buy bonds with? Money. So money's going out into the world. When the Fed sells bonds, they are pulling money back in. So think about them taking that money and locking it up. That impacts interbank lending because if banks have money, then they can lend it out. If they have it tied up in securities, then they're not going to lend it out because they've already purchased a security and loaned it to our government. If banks have money, then that impacts loans to consumers and businesses. These choices are made by the Open Market Committee. They meet and set interbank lending rate, which is known as the Fed funds rate. This treasury rate is sort of the base rate for the entire economy. It's the price of money. When the government borrows money, they borrow it by selling bonds at the Fed funds rate. So that's the rate that banks charge each other. It's often called the overnight rate because these banks often borrow for very short periods of time if they haven't met their required reserve ratio. The Fed funds rate is what the Fed targets. They can't force the rate to be something. It's actually still set by a market, but they say they want to keep it in a certain range. So the Fed recently dropped the Fed funds rate to 0 to 0.25%, meaning that borrowing is essentially free for banks, or only 0.25%. So that's 0.25% or 0.0025. So that rate is extremely low right now as I speak during the coronavirus pandemic because we want to keep money moving.
Times are really hard. I can't loan you any money. Oh no, nobody's lending. I'm gonna buy some lawn for you. I can give you that loan now.
All right, to recap, the Federal Reserve is going to increase the money supply by doing the following. They will buy securities, they will cut the discount rate, cut the reserve ratio, and cut interest on reserves. In my life, and I've seen one major economic crisis in 2009, and I'm currently living through the pandemic, the only tools that the Fed has used is the commonly used tool of buying and selling securities. During this time, they would buy bonds because we're in contractions. They would buy these securities. They have cut the discount rate. They did that during 2009, and then, of course, raised it slowly after that recession ended. And they did it most recently with the COVID-19 crisis. And they would adjust the interest rate on reserves. That's only been available since 2008, and they have been doing it since then. And they cut the interest rate on reserves during this COVID crisis. If the Fed wants to decrease the money supply, they'll do the exact opposite. So if they see that the economy is moving too fast, and this was what was happening in the last quarter of 2019, the Federal Reserve was selling securities. So they were bringing money out of the economy and locking it up in their bank. So you would hold the security, which of course you can't sell or liquidate very quickly. It's not a part of M1. They were raising the discount rate. So the discount rate went up. And they had raised the interest on reserves. They, of course, could also raise the reserve ratio, but again, very uncommon tool. So, expansionary monetary policy, when the economy is in contraction, you buy bonds, cut rates. Contractionary monetary policy, when the economy is expanding, you sell bonds and raise rates.
That's how the Federal Reserve works. Contractions on the Fed will buy bonds and contractions on